Thank you all for taking the time to come along today, distinguished guests, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here to help celebrate the 100th birthday of the Bank of Estonia. It's a particular pleasure and privilege to be doing it in this room, in the Independence Hall, with its rich history, which I can see from the painting at the back. I spent yesterday on a guided tour of the old town. It's my first time in Estonia, hearing about the rich and proud history of this country. And it really provided some color and some context for being here today in the Independence Hall, with the Declaration of Independence being signed just behind me. That history, extremely rich and full of revolutions. And today, I thought I would talk to you about revolutions. Now, that is not something much spoken about by central bankers. But I want to argue today that we as central bankers are dealing with not one, but two revolutions. Two. There is the revolution that has happened, not so much a singing revolution as a talking revolution among central banks. Central bankers can't, in general, sing, but they can talk, and today is a demonstration of that. That is the past, but I'm going to argue that we will require as central banks a second revolution. One where we talk not just to the experts, among the experts, but to a non-expert audience as well. We engage much more fully with the general public, with ordinary folk. There are a number of reasons why that might be, but a crucial one is that we as central banks, we as policymakers, stand to learn, to better understand the economy, to better set policy by engaging directly with that broader audience, with the general public. There is wisdom in folk, in ordinary people, from which we stand to benefit. I want to try and explain why that is, and I want to try and explain what we as central bankers need to do to be able to tap that wisdom. This second great revolution in central banking, I think, will define the second century of the Bank of Estonia, and indeed the fourth century of the Bank of England, or that at least is what I'm going to argue this morning. Let me start with a story about why I think the wisdom of the general public, the wisdom of folk, of ordinary folk, can really help. So, 3 years ago now, I was traveling around the UK. I traveled to a place called Nottingham, which is in the middle of England, as I often do, to speak to people about the economy. Now, at that stage, the UK economy was doing pretty well. It was creating jobs, incomes. GDP had just gone above its level before the crisis in the UK. We were in an economic recovery. So I turned up to a crowd about this size of companies, and we discussed the economy. I said, this has been jobs rich. GDP is above its level before the crisis. We are in an economic recovery. And they all nodded along. They agreed. This fitted with their lived experience. I went from that meeting to a very different meeting. It was a meeting not of companies, but of charities, of not-for-profit companies. I began my talk of jobs-rich recovery, of GDP being above its level before the crisis, And about 30 seconds in, someone stopped me, said, hang on, just one quick question, Andy, if I may. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? I don't recognize this thing you call the economic recovery. And then we went around the table to every charity, every not-for-profit company in the room, and they all told the same story. That recovery fit none of their lived experiences. None of the people they were dealing with was experiencing a recovery. If anything, their fortunes were headed south, not north. So I was perplexed by this. I went back to the Bank of England's head office in London, and I said to my economists, we have a lot of economists, which isn't always a good thing, despite being one. I said to them, hang on, I went to Nottingham, I heard these stories. Could you just look at the data again? Look at the data and tell me, are there any towns or cities, or perhaps even regions across the UK that haven't, in fact, experienced an economic recovery? They're still below where they were before the crisis. And they came back to me later that day and said, yes, actually, Andy, there are one or two towns and cities where this is the case. And I said, which ones? Was Nottingham one of them? And they said, well, for a starting point, there's Scotland. That's a country. Well, the whole of Scotland. Yeah, whole of Scotland. Anywhere else? They said, yeah, there's also Wales and Northern Ireland. They're also countries. Okay. Anywhere in England? And they said, yeah, there are some parts of England as well that haven't experienced recovery. There's the southwest of England and the east of England and the Midlands and the northwest of England and the northeast of England. Hang on. So what you're really saying is nowhere had recovered other than London and the southeast of England. And they said, yeah, that's right. You've got there, Andy. Well done. Because they're quite patronizing, the economists, sometimes. And that was a revelation. In fact, I'd been speaking the language of economic recovery across the UK, when in fact, only a small fraction had genuinely experienced recovery. Those charities in the Midlands had told me something about the economy that I had not got from looking over all that data, from speaking to all of those companies. There was wisdom in folk about the economy out there. And that we needed to understand and tap if we were to understand the economy and set policy for the economy. That's the punchline of this talk. But let me start further back before I get to that as my punchline. Here's roughly the plan, if I get through this. I'll talk about the first great revolution, the revolution in central banking of the past. I want to talk about how the crisis has brought in a new age for central banks, a new age for public institutions. That the age of innocence for central banks, the age of innocence for public institutions, for trust in them, is over. And what that means is that we as central banks, we as public institutions, are living with twin deficits. Deficit of understanding among the public and a deficit of trust within the public. And the task for us now is to seek to close those twin deficits. So we'll talk a bit about things that the Bank of England is doing to begin to close those twin deficits of public understanding and of public trust. Let me start, though, at the very beginning by talking about the first great wave of central banking. Because in some ways, the 20th century was a golden era for central banks, at least in terms of numbers. Here are numbers of central banks through the course of the 20th century. They went from fewer than 20 at the beginning of that century to 160, 170 by its end. I've marked on here in green the founding, of course, of this great central bank in 1919. In fact, what we found between the start and the end of the 20th century is that the creation of a central bank was seen as being an essential building block of creating a nation state. And there is, of course, no better example of just that than in this country, indeed in this very room. But it wasn't just greater numbers of central banks that we saw through the 20th century, but also greater sets of responsibilities being given to them, greater degrees of independence in the setting, for example, of monetary policy or of regulatory policy. A topical issue, this being Independence Hall, to talk about central bank independence. The right-hand side chart just looks at the numbers of central banks that were vested with independence, either for monetary or for regulatory tools. This came in part on the back of a poor experience in many advanced economies during the 1970s, a period of so-called great inflation. It was that in many countries was the prompt for handing responsibility for monetary policy to an arm's length, apolitical central bank. Now, with those increased powers for central banks came increased responsibilities, including an increased responsibility to explain yourself, to explain what were your policy intentions, to explain to people what were your policy actions. And let me tell you, this did not come easily to most central banks. For most of their history, there had been a tradition not of openness and transparency, but of secrecy and opacity. Here's a couple of quotes from a couple of former central bank governors that really embodies their view on what central banks should do and say. I mean, the bottom line is very little. They should do, but not say. In the words of perhaps the Bank of England's most famous governor, a man called Montague Norman, who presided as governor between 1920 and 1944, central bankers should never apologize and never explain. So when asked around the time of sterling returning to the gold standard by politicians in 1930 why that had happened, what were the reasons that had happened, Norman replied, "I don't have reasons, I have instincts." And that very much embodies the prevailing central bank orthodoxy of the time. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, British economist, said of Montague Norman, I like this quote, he said, "He was always charming and always wrong." And he was certainly wrong about this. But this orthodoxy prevailed right through, certainly to the 1980s, where the Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, there's a whole selection of possible Alan Greenspan quotes, but here's one that makes clear that secrecy was still the name of the game. Increased responsibilities meant secrecy was no longer tolerable, was no longer acceptable. What we've seen over the past several decades is a genuine revolution in the degree of openness and transparency among central banks. Here's two pictures that speak to that. The left-hand side one is taken from the Bank of England. It's the number of speeches it has given over the past 100 years or so. Up until around the 1960s, the Bank of England would give precisely one speech a year. Yeah, I will speak today for twice as long as a Bank of England governor would have done in a whole year back in 1960. Okay? Since then, we have seen this pick up such that scarcely a day passes without someone getting up and speaking. Today it's me. And that trend has been mirrored throughout central banks across the world, of course, very much including here at the Bank of Estonia as well. And I would say this revolution, and it is a revolution, so since 1970, the number of appearances before Parliament by the Bank of England has increased 20-fold. Its number of publications has increased 600-fold. The number of words we publish has increased 1,000-fold. 4.5 million last year. I got someone to count them. That is the scale of the revolution. It has been a global revolution, and revolution does not overstate what has happened. And it has served as well as central banks, I would argue. Immediately prior to the global financial crisis, the global economy went through a period of strong and stable growth and steady inflation, a period called the Great Moderation. This chart just looks at the degree of volatility in inflation, measured vertically, and in output, measured horizontally. We transitioned globally from the great inflation of the 1970s to the Great Moderation of the 90s and early noughties. And I would argue central bank independence and central bank transparency played an important role in securing that much better set of outcomes for the global economy and indeed for national economies within that. Of course, that was a story right up until the point until it was no longer the story. And the break point for this story, the next chapter, came with the dawning of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Since then, we have seen ourselves transition from great moderation to great recession. We have seen in particular this sideways movement in which output, incomes, wages in the economy have become materially more volatile than the period immediately prior to the crisis. And this has had costs. It has obviously had very significant costs for the economy. That has been one of the casualties of crisis. But so too have been central banks. As stewards, as guardians of the economy, as guardians of the financial system, when the financial system folded in some countries, that brought about something of a loss of trust in central banks globally. This chart provides some indication for one or two countries and one or two central banks of that loss of trust among the public. Trust in central banks proved to be somewhat fragile in the course of the crisis. Now, at one level, this is a bit disappointing. Central banks have just gone through a great revolution in their degree of transparency. And yet, when the crisis came, trust in them proved to be, after all, rather fragile. Why was that? Why did trust prove rather fragile? Well, I think one very important reason why that happened is because the foundation of trust is understanding. And in truth, despite this great revolution in central bank transparency practices, the public's understanding of the economy, the public's understanding of central banks had not really improved. Those 4.5 million words issued by the Bank of England last year had largely fallen on deaf ears among the general public. They had been consumed by the experts in financial markets, among economists, in parts of the media, but had not been pitched at a level that was accessible to ordinary people, to non-experts, to the general public. So my stylized fact on this is that at least 95% of all central bank communications are inaccessible, cannot be understood by at least 95% of the population. And those are numbers I've plucked at random. You can go through central bank publications, as I have, and look at the complexity of the language that they use, and ask how many of the general public would find those words understandable. The answer is somewhere between 2 and 10%. Okay? By and large, that transparency revolution had bypassed the great majority of the population, the great majority of the public, the great majority of whom are non-expert in issues around the economy and issues around central banks and policy. Diagnostic on that. So back in year 2000, the Bank of England began surveying the public on various things, including, did they understand who central banks were, what they did for a living? Now, in the UK, monetary policy is set by this thing called the Monetary Policy Committee, MPC. I'm a member of that. Back in 2000, we asked the public, who sets interest rates in the UK? And a very disappointing 6% answered the MPC. What followed has been 18 years of transparency revolution. Yet, when we asked the public last year the self-same question, the answer was still 6%. The dial had not moved, despite the revolution. And that is because, by and large, the words we use, all 4.5 million of them, have not been focused on the majority of the general public. That breeds a lack of understanding, and therein are sown the seeds of a lack of public trust. So I will argue that we as central banks, we as public authorities, in fact, this is not just central banks, face a so-called twin deficits problem, by which I mean a deficit of understanding among the public and a deficit of trust among the public. And to meet those deficits, to close those deficits, we need, therefore, a twin-tracked set of solutions, which form the basis of a second revolution. And the two elements are to build a much greater degree of understanding among the general public in the economy, in policy, and in central banks. And as importantly, more importantly, to build understanding among central banks of the public. This is genuinely two-sided. This isn't just about us talking. This is about us listening as central banks. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And the next revolution is about central banks using their ears a little more than they have in the past. Let me start on the first then, which is building public understanding of the economy and of policy. What I want to argue now is that this issue has always been important. Of course it is. If we had a show of hands today, who thinks improved public understanding of the economy is important? I'm sure I'll not carry out this referendum. If I did, I'm sure everyone would agree. I mean, what's the not to agree with about that? Of course. If you survey the public, they say this. 80, 90% say that they'd like to know more. But I want to argue that as economists, as policymakers, we have underestimated the benefits of improved public understanding. And therefore, we have underinvested in initiatives to support improved public understanding of the economy. Why do I say that? Well, of course, this is partly because the initial endowment of understanding is very low. If you ask the public, what does GDP mean? Only a small minority know. If you ask them what inflation means, only a small minority know. That's been known for a long time. What we didn't realize, I think, until relatively recently, is the costs not knowing imposes on individuals and on the broader economy and financial system. We now know a lot about not knowing, how not knowing about the financial system might lead to debt and default and depression. The costs of being financially illiterate are huge, not just to your financial health, but to your physical and mental health as well. That's at the level of the micro. And those costs of not knowing are amplified up when you go to the macro level, to the whole economy level. A less well-informed public is more uncertain, and uncertainty comes with a real cost. A less well-informed public is more likely to form a ill-conceived, incorrect set of stories, set of narratives about the economy, so-called popular narratives. And that too can generate greater instability in the wider economy. The research base on this is now very strong and very powerful. The power of expectations in driving behavior for the individual and for the economy. These two economists, Robert Shiller and George Akerlof, Nobel laureates both, have spoken about how the popular narratives that ordinary people use are crucial. The stories they tell are crucial for explaining the peaks of booms and the troughs of busts. They are a crucial determinant of the business cycle in the economy. Those narratives matter, and the better informed those narratives, the more stable the economy. Let me give you a topical for the UK example of how narratives can be used. Ordinary people's narratives about the economy, how they can be used to understand the economy. The story I want to talk about is something you're at a safe distance from, but I'm not, which is Brexit. Okay. You'll probably be unsurprised to hear that Brexit crops up quite a lot in the conversations I have with the bank's contacts. We can take the write-ups of those conversations and just see how often different words appear in them. A narrative, word-based approach to gauging uncertainty. Here's what it looks like. So the left-hand side, can you see that? It's a little bit light, but this is left-hand side is a word cloud, and the size of the word judges how often it's used in conversations with our company contacts across the UK. The one word you probably can see is Brexit. And that's because that's the word that's being used most often in our conversations with contacts right now. That appears 10 times more frequently than the words staff or customers in our conversations. You turn it into a time series of how often are different words used in our conversations with external parties. So the red here is mentions of Brexit or the referendum. The blue is measures of uncertainty. You'll see that after the UK referendum on the EU, that Brexit metric narrative spiked. It has fallen a bit, but has spiked recently. This is the use of narratives by ordinary people to try and understand behavior and uncertainty in the economy. If that's one dimension of improving or shrinking the deficits of trust and understanding, I want to talk about the second. The second is central banks drawing upon the general public to better inform their understanding of the economy and policy. That's a bit more controversial, I think. It's certainly been less standard practice. And of course, it poses a bit of a dilemma. So if we are to gather together the views of a wider range of the public, what will we get back? Well, one possibility is we get back wisdom, the wisdom of crowds. Something spoken about by this guy, James Surowiecki, back in 2004. It's been known about for a long time. So back in the 19th century, in England, there was a famous statistician called Galton. He once went to a village fair where people were trying to guess the weight of an ox. And he was amazed that while everyone's individual guesses about the weight of the ox were quite inaccurate, if you added them all up and averaged them, the public were about right. There was wisdom. I mean, these people weren't experts in the weight of oxes. That wasn't their profession. But if you averaged up non-expert opinion, the result was actually something fairly accurate. There was indeed wisdom in crowds. Many other examples since. But are crowds always wise? I am sure we can all think of examples where we experience not the wisdom of crowds, but instead their madness, to use the words of Charles Mackay in another famous book way back in 1841. Think of financial madness, the South Sea bubble, tulip mania, the dot-com bubble, perhaps even the global financial crisis. And of course, these examples aren't confined to economics and finance. Many examples of collective or group psychology generating very odd outcomes. So which is it? Which is it? If we tap the views of crowds, will we get wisdom or will we get madness? And my answer to that question, this is a typical economist's answer to any question, is that it depends. It depends. And the two things on which I want to argue it depends are two Ds. The two Ds are diversity and deliberation. How does that work? Diversity of opinion is good. It means different perspectives on a problem. When that problem is complex, the greater the number of different perspectives, the greater the chances of a creative solution. So greater diversity is good. That calls for a bigger crowd, because the bigger the crowd, the greater the diversity of view, expert and non-expert. That's one side of the coin. The other, though, which goes in the other direction, is deliberation. And by that I mean complex decision-making is difficult. It doesn't call for snap judgments. It takes time to think, to assess solutions, to deliberate among people in coming up with an answer. Finding good answers, weeding out bad answers takes time. Time to deliberate. And that works in the opposite direction. Because not everyone has the time to discuss, debate, and to deliberate on complex problems. There's a trade-off between the two. In seeking the wisdom of crowds, we are seeking a balance between diversity and deliberation. Where to strike that balance? Well, in some ways, the most authoritative evidence on this comes from this political scientist called Philip Tetlock, who ran this so-called good judgment project in the United States over a wide range of problems and across more than 20 years. He looked in particular about, was it possible for non-experts, the general public, to improve our capacity to make complex decisions? And he tested this with real people and real decisions. So one of his famous examples, he posed a big question in political economy. He gathered together 1,000 non-experts and asked them to forecast the outcome for this big question, and then compared their forecasts with those of experts, academic experts and experts from the intelligence services. And what he found, dramatically, is that the diversity of non-expert view led to them producing very good forecasts. Indeed, forecasts that were, after 1 year, 60% better than those of academics at MIT and Columbia. Forecasts that after 2 years were 78% better than the forecasts even of the US intelligence services, who had access to classified information. These are the people, the non-experts, that he ended up calling in his book super forecasters. They could out-forecast the experts because of the diversity they brought to a complex problem. But, and the but's important, not everyone's a super forecaster. Not all of his pool were able to achieve these benefits. There were certain characteristics of them, of people, that gave them the capacity to outdo the experts, that enabled them to become super forecasters. What were those characteristics? They were very independent-minded. They were very inquisitive. And crucially, they took the time. They took the time to assess different solutions, to look at different bits of evidence, and to deliberate, keyword, to deliberate and debate on that evidence. Not everyone is a super forecaster, but those with those characteristics could become one. So I've taken that evidence, I've turned it into a sort of model, which I'm now going to reveal for the first time, actually. This is a first for me, not just for me. So what is this model of? So imagine we all face a very complex problem to which literally no one knows the answer. Let me give you one, topical one, which is what will be the impact of artificial intelligence on unemployment? Okay, it's a very topical and widely debated issue. No one knows. No one really knows. Lots of opinions, some expert, some less expert. Let's assume that's the question. And the challenge we face is how many people should we gather together to help us reach a judgment on that question? How many? How many people should we choose? I'm going to set you a time constraint. Okay, I'm going to give you 10,000 hours to solve that problem, to spread across however many people you want, okay, to help solve this problem. Now, I've chosen 10,000 hours for a reason, because if any of you have read the book Outliers by the American author Malcolm Gladwell, he says it takes 10,000 hours of practice to be truly expert. So I'm taking 10,000 hours to be true expertise. That's your endowment. And the question is, how many people should I draw on, optimally, to reach the best informed view possible of this complex question? The impact of AI on unemployment. Well, here's my answer, diagrammatically. Let me try and explain it. So running vertically, I have a measure of the insight that you gain from your pool of people, okay? This is how good your decision is on this complex question. Running vertically, I have the number of people on which you draw to form your view, bearing in mind your fixed time constraint of 10,000 hours. Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. What are the possible sets of solutions? Well, one solution is that you choose one person, okay, with 10,000 hours of experience. They are, under Gladwell's definition, a true expert, okay? That's on the far left-hand side. That's the oracle solution in the Greek sense of the word. There's one person, you seek them out, they are the best qualified expert imaginable. You ask them for their view. That will be rich in deliberation. 10,000 hours of deliberation, that's a lot of deliberation. But it will be poor in diversity. Only one person's perspective. Okay? That's one possible choice. Another one, opposite end of the spectrum. Let's choose everyone. Let's choose 1 million people, which is what roughly the adult population of Estonia. Let's have a referendum on this question, right? Well, that will give you lots of diversity, right? Probably 1 million views. But if you've only got 10,000 hours, that will mean that every person can only spend 30 seconds on this problem. Not very much time for deliberation. So if I give each of you 30 seconds to give me your answer on what is the impact of artificial intelligence on unemployment, I'm guessing you'd find that quite difficult. I certainly would find that quite difficult. And my view, given 30 seconds, would not be especially well informed. I would have no time to assess the solutions, assess the evidence. It would not be rich in insight. I would have not the wisdom of crowds, but potentially the madness of crowds. That's the far right-hand side. So can I do better? I want to argue that you can. Imagine I choose as my group this room. This room. So roughly 100 people. I have 10,000 hours, so you each have 100 hours to deliberate on this problem. That's quite a lot of time. And I'm guessing that the collective insight of this room, each spending 100 hours, would generate much, much greater levels of insight than either the oracle solution, one person, have a greater expertise, or the population solution, which risks the madness of crowds. Or that, at least, is my contention. In between, we have an optimal number of people on which to draw when seeking insight on this complex problem. I want to come back to that, but the next question, Ada, how much time do I have left? When should I stop talking? Carry on? 10 minutes, perfect. Let's say you buy that story. The answer's not one person, one expert. The answer's not everyone. It is a mix of experts and non-experts gives you the optimal degree of insight, the optimal balance between diversity of view and time to deliberate on that view. Next question, how do you do that? How, as central banks, do we seek to draw in this non-expert opinion? What infrastructure do we need to make it happen? It won't happen automatically. How do we make it happen? How do we try and ensure decision-making is truly representative of wider society? Well, you'd be unsurprised to hear this is about as deep a question in political science as you can possibly imagine. And of course, many models of representative decision-making have been tried and tested over the years, from which I would just mention three. These three I pick out because they involve different balances, different trade-offs between those two Ds, the desire for diversity of view and the desire for time to come up with that view, deliberation. One, these days when we talk about democracy in many countries, what we're talking about is executive democracy, by which I mean we have a set of elected or appointed officials who act on society's behalf. That's often what we talk about, certainly here in Estonia, in the UK, in the US, in most advanced economies, we are talking about a model of representative decision-making that is an executive democracy. How does that fare? Well, it fares well on deliberation. You have a parliament, you have politicians. They sit in parliaments for hours deliberating on issues. They have the time. But questions have been asked, are being asked, about whether that executive is sufficiently representative. Does it contain sufficient diversity to mirror the views of broader society? So here's a different model with a different balance. Direct democracy. What does that mean? That means each and every decision is decided by the public, by a referendum. One vote, one voice. That occurs in some countries. It's a different model of decision-making. That involves a lot of diversity. You're asking everyone. But it runs the risk of relatively little deliberation. You're drawing upon so wide a pool, many of them will not take the time, sometimes, or be able to solve that complex problem. Now, there's a third way, there's a third model, which it turns out is not new, but in fact the oldest of the lot. And that goes by the name of deliberative democracy. That involves bringing together both expert and non-experts in a single place to tackle complex societal issues. And this model has its origins in a location that is, for many people, the very birthplace of democracy, namely ancient Greece, the city-state of Athens. There, 2,500 years ago, their approach to representative decision-making was to gather together a council of 500 non-experts to debate, discuss, and deliberate on the key issues of the day. That was the Athenian notion of democracy. And that model, which was then lost and forgotten for many centuries, many millennia, we have seen reappearing just recently in a range of countries, including here in Estonia. So the people's assemblies that were put in place back in, 2013 on electoral law, last year on ageings and pensions reform, are an example of bringing together expert a non-expert opinion to discuss, debate, and deliberate on a key societal issue. We see a similar sort of structure popping up all over the world. In Canada, in Australia, in Holland, in Belgium, and elsewhere, in the US. And the reason for putting it on the table is in some ways deliberative democracy, one way of justifying it, is precisely in terms of my insight curve. The balance between diversity and deliberation would position that structure, that decision-making structure, right slap bang in the center of the insight curve, the trade-off between diversity and deliberation. That's the theory. Let's turn this practically, because what can we do as central banks? What have we done as central banks to harness the wisdom of crowds, to boost public understanding of the economy and central banks' understanding of the public? Let me mention one or two initiatives before I close. These will be elements, only elements, but possible elements of the second revolution in improving engagement between central banks and wider society. First point, the language you use as central banks really matters. If we are to reach the parts we have not previously reached, that 95%, we need to speak in words and sentences and paragraphs and pages that people can understand. And not just understand, but can link it to their lives. The material is relatable. It's personalized. Personalization and simplification are crucial for building understanding and crucial for building trust. The reason I know that is because we've recently done just that. We have for 25 years published a quarterly report on the economy. It's called the Inflation Report. It is 60 pages long. It contains 100 charts. It is written as in a technical language. It is understood by almost no one and read by almost no one as a consequence. It was part of the Great Leap Forward. It was part of the first revolution of transparency initiatives. But of course, it was pitched at a certain audience. As of last November, we changed it for the first time in 25 years. We created not one layer of reports, but 3 layers. And the 2 other layers were much simpler and much shorter. We created this, which is the 1-sentence, 1-graphic version of that 60-page document. And we created a 1-page, 2 or 3 graphic version to try and reach the parts of the public we had not previously reached, the 95%. Did it work? Did it work? Well, had it not worked, I would have been speaking about it, would I? So almost certainly is going to work. But the reason I'm reasonably confident it did work is that we did something which in other domains is the gold standard of testing, which is a so-called randomized control trial. We took 2,000 people in the public and we divided them up. We give them one, the old version of the report. We gave them one, the new version of the report. And we gave a third group an even simpler, an even more personalized version of the report. And we assessed what impact this had on their understanding. This is the answer. So moving from our old style model to our new style model boosted understanding by 25%. That was good news. Even more interestingly, or certainly as interestingly, was that a version of our simple visual summary that was more personalized, it didn't speak in neutral terms. It used the words you or us. Instead of talking about inflation, which no one understands, it spoke about the cost of things in the shops. Instead of having static, complex graphics, it had very nice, colourful, interactive ones. Very simple things. But that provided a boost to understanding of a whopping 40%. This is the same stuff. This is the same material, just made simpler and shorter and personalized in various ways. Dramatic leaps forward in the general public's understanding. Now, that's the good news. The less good news is this does very little for trust, okay? Understanding is one thing. Trust takes time. You won't get trust from a one-off experiment. That will take time. But at least the foundation, the understanding foundation, is there. Could we go further? Should we go further? I think we probably should. I'll tell you why. What central banks do, what they offer real people, is hard for them to understand. We don't hand out wads of money. What we do is stimulate the economy to create jobs. And people tend to not really appreciate what's going on here, right? So when you get a job or a pay rise or a loan, most people don't say, I should thank the central bank for that. You know, that's not the way they keep score, by and large. They think it's down to their own good luck or good management. They're not saying, you know, I'm really pleased that Ardo's done his job or that Andy's done his job. And that's a problem. And that's because our actions aren't very personalized. Why not? Could we make our actions more personalized? Could we link what we do as central banks more directly to people's lives? Well, I think we could. In fact, the reason I know that is because I gave a speech on it about 3 months ago. Well, I did just that. I drew up, so this was an answer to the essay question, don't worry about the numbers. How has looser monetary policy affected you? And you, and you, and you. So it depends, of course. It depends whether I'm a saver or a borrower, whether I'm old or young, whether I'm rich or poor. But I can say, whatever your characteristics, this is how monetary policy has affected you. This is how it's affected your income. This is how it's affected your job. You can set that out in very granular detail. This is a personalized scorecard. Your personalized scorecard for how monetary policy has affected you. Something that's been shown in different domains to increase both understanding of policy and trust in policy. That's one element. A second is public education. We've put at the Bank of England a big program in place of public education in schools. Not just turning up and giving talks, we do that, but actually creating materials that can be taught in the classroom as part of the school's curriculum. I can say some more about that. Finally, last, and this is really the next frontier, our next frontier, is that if we are to reach the public, citizens, non-experts, to talk and, as importantly, to listen, we need some vehicle. We need some equivalent of that Athenian bull. We need some equivalent of that Estonian public assembly as central banks. And we are just about to start to create an infrastructure that does just that. It goes by the name citizens' panels. It involves convening groups of non-experts drawn randomly from right across the UK to discuss and debate and deliberate, that word again, the key issues facing the economy and the key issues facing policy, and to use those as an infrastructure to generate that folk wisdom and bring it back to the table of policymakers like me. This is one of the new frontiers for us in what is our second great revolution. Time is up, so let me just conclude. We have gone as central banks, we have gone as public institutions from this age of innocence, this age of trust, through a great transparency revolution and out the other side. But that has not built the public understanding and the public trust we need in future to thrive as central banks, to thrive as public institutions. We need a second revolution that reaches the parts of the public we have not previously reached with new tools and new techniques. That is quite an agenda. That second great revolution is quite an agenda for the Bank of Estonia in its second century. It's quite an agenda for the Bank of England in the middle of its fourth century. And I hope today I've given you one or two reflections of what form that revolution might take. Thank you all for listening so attentively.